Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Now, before starting the podcast, I want to remind folks that we do have a Patreon for growers who want access to the Raw podcast weeks earlier, as well as extra content that we don't share publicly. I also recently published a review of the BIOS Luna LED light on our YouTube channel that you can check out. And if you're in the market for LEDs for your facility or have questions about lighting, please do reach out. Now on to the show. My guest this week is Christine DeJesus. Christine operates at the intersection of regenerative organic agriculture and social justice. For 5 years, she's been perfecting a highly efficient organic cultivation model while managing operations for Cannabis in Akron, Ohio. Prior, she worked in food justice, ran a farm for Great Lakes Brewing Company, functioned as a campaign coordinator for Marijuana Policy Project, and co-founded the Midwest Canna Women. She was featured in the documentary Polycultures, Food Where We Live with Michael Pollan, and at the My Global Kitchen exhibit at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Christine is a creative writer, a columnist for Cannabis Business Times magazine, and holds degrees from both Kent State and the University of Pittsburgh. In her current role, she focuses on keeping plants, processes, and people healthy and productive while delivering top-tier quality cannabis flower to Ohio consumers. Christine also works with home growers to bring commercial-level success to their backyard gardens. Now on to the show. Hey, Christine, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we start off? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I've spent the last 6 years with Cannabis, an indoor living soil certified kind or certified organic grow in Akron, Ohio. And prior to that, I worked in vegetable farming for Great Lakes Brewing Company, spent 13 years in the field growing 30 or 40 different crops and just learning how to grow vegetables, hops, pumpkins for the pumpkin ale, things like that. And I've also worked in policy quite a bit, worked for Marijuana Policy Project, created a network of signature gatherers for various campaigns to legalize medical marijuana, did some lobbying, lobbied in DC, and spent some time really just kind of building networks of activists to help essentially legalize medical marijuana in Ohio, which now led to our adult use legalization as well. I have 3 children, 3 wonderful children. I even have my first grandchild now. So I've spent a long time raising kids and growing healthy foods for all of them to eat as well, and been involved with food policy and food access in neighborhoods where I live.
Oh, that's great. I wanted to ask you, so prior to getting into Galenas, had you grown cannabis? Because it sounds like your background is really in vegetable production.
Yeah, so primarily I've focused on vegetable production, and really that ties back into raising children. So I did grow cannabis when I was very young, and I was part of the marijuana culture, I would say, from a teenager on. And then when my children were born, I decided it wasn't worth the risk, essentially. Ohio's been a prohibition state for a very long time, and for me personally, the two just couldn't work together, couldn't coexist. So I took my energy of wanting to grow cannabis and put it into vegetable production until legalization passed, and then was able to finally dive full in on legal cannabis production.
Okay, so you had some familiarity with the plant and some of the differences between that and say, some of these vegetable crops like pumpkins and you mentioned hops. How did that experience, coming from agriculture, help you when you moved to? I mean, you're moving from outdoor production too. It sounds like to controlled environment agriculture indoors. How did that process help you, and what things did you kind of have to get up to speed on?
So it definitely prepared me quite a bit. It growing so many different vegetables too, like in a more polyculture farm setting, I think I just learned the essentials of what plants crave, what they need to grow. So I was pretty well versed on growing everything from like spring crops and cole crops to tomatoes, hops, which are totally different, perennials, fruit trees. I just became sort of well versed in plants overall. But I was concerned for sure when I moved into indoor agriculture. Um, and just because I didn't essentially grow cannabis myself at home during those years while I was growing vegetables, I definitely assisted some other people in growing cannabis. So I had close friends, of course, that were growers and um, spent quite a bit of time learning from them and kind of preparing myself for when I would be able to grow commercially. But moving into indoor production, my biggest concern when I moved from outdoors indoors really was, can I do the same things that I'm doing outside inside without running the risk of failing crops for microbials? I mean, that was honestly my biggest risk because I've always grown organically. I've always had like this soil food web sort of production model. And I was definitely very concerned that I would have problems failing for beneficial bacteria, essentially, or fungi. And that fear led me to be more restrictive over what things I use indoors until I started passing some tests and making sure that I was going to be able to kind of use the same systems that I had used outside. But of course, it was a big adjustment. And I think some things I found are a lot easier. Like, of course, you're not dealing with the weather and the rain, and you're able to control the climate, and that makes a huge difference. And some things have been a little more challenging, like just like using soil, managing the dusts really is a big thing. So when you're transplanting, when you're moving soil throughout a building, being very cautious as to where those dusts are going and doing a ton of sanitation, of course, to stay on top of um, the residues and buildups that you can get from using soil in an indoor operation have been a challenge. But we've been very successful. We have a 95% pass rate over the past 6 years, which I think is very good for living soil indoors. And we also have the benefit of having like a really nice terp profile, yields, and just kind of an overall very high quality that we've established, which I think a lot of that is attributed to the compost-based mediums and different techniques that we're using indoors that our competitors essentially aren't.
Now you have the added challenge of Ohio regulations to where you had to build vertically, correct?
Correct.
Um,
Yes.
just because of the way the laws are structured. Can you talk about that a little bit and describe sort of
Sure.
what your facility looks like?
Yeah, so Ohio has a different regulations model. They're not limited by plant count or regulated by plant count, and they're also not regulated by canopy size, but rather by regulated room footprint. So currently there was two tiers of medical cultivation size. One was 25,000 square foot of indoor regulated room. The other was 3,000 square foot. So I'm in the smaller grow, which was the 3,000 square foot. But the ownership group of the company decided to essentially exploit that legally, compliantly, by building vertically. I know that I think Flora and Flame, which was a guest previously on your show, the head cultivator there, spoke about their grow being modeled after the Grove in Las Vegas. So Galenas, where I work, was also modeled after that grow, which I think is kind of a common theme for this being a new style of producing cannabis indoors. And so it was built, designed to have three growing tiers in each of the two flower rooms. So the two flower rooms are both 1,500 square foot, but have three tiers of cultivation across the, vertically. And so we're essentially growing on all those three tiers. So we're really operating at essentially 9,000 square foot of growing space, but only 3,000 square foot of room footprint.
And tell me a little bit about your cultivation method. So you mentioned living soil. You are in containers. Some people have pushed back on this idea of living soils being in containers, saying, if you're truly living soil, you're reusing the soil, you're in beds. Um, I don't get quite as caught up in those semantics. So I'm fine with you using the term living soil. I think
Mhm.
as long as you're focused on cultivating with biology in mind, with that concept of nutrient cycling coming from the microbes in your soil, then that soil's alive and it's living soil. So what size containers are you using? What does that process sort of look like? in your facility?
So yeah, the living soil thing is definitely a term that I had never used prior to coming into cannabis. So like a compost-based medium or compost-based potting soil is probably the more accurate term. Living soil and what exactly that implies, I don't know if that's defined by pot size or exactly the parameters around officially using that term, but it's definitely something very commonly used in the cannabis industry, and so I guess I've adopted it a bit, but we're currently growing in 10 and 15 gallon pots. When I first started, the facility was using 5 gallon fabric pots, and they were running 2,000 plants per room. I've since, over the course of 5 years, reduced the number of plants down to 744 per room. So it was a substantial reduction in plant count. I know that there are definitely trends that point or data that points to more of a sea of green and having a larger population of plants that are much smaller in size can achieve higher yields in certain systems. And I think that there's definitely a place for that, and that's potentially a way to achieve greater yields in certain systems. But our building was designed essentially for larger plants because the tiers are 7 feet apart. Um, and also, they didn't have gutters, so they were not designed for like an automated watering system. So my strategy was to reduce the touch points essentially that people are having to do, because labor being one of our greatest costs, it made the most sense to, when you have to take all of your plants and put them on a scissor lift and lift them up 10 and 20 plus feet into the air and then set them on a bench and repeat that cycle every 60 days, it made more sense for us to be using less plants per bench, but in a bigger pot. The advantage to that also is that it is a bigger pot and there's more soil. So the soil biology can stay alive more easily. It's more stable because it's in this larger pot. So we use 15-gallon pots on the bottom tier, and then we use 10-gallon pots on the second and third tier. And I've seen a slightly larger increase in yield per plant in the 15 gallon over the 10 gallon. It does depend on the cultivar. So I've seen some cultivars that actually produce slightly higher at 10 gallons, but the majority of them produce roughly 5% higher yield in the 15 gallon over the 10 gallon. But in both size pots, we're able to really keep the soil microbiology very stable and also have the watering cycle that is the most efficient for our team. This was also, as most of the decisions I've made in the facility, very team driven. So, I go to the cultivation technicians, hey, what would you rather do? Lift 20 plants, 20 pots that are lighter onto a bench, or 10 pots that are heavier? And the consensus was always 10 pots that are heavier. So it's more efficient. We're able to load a room in essentially 12 hours, and we're able to offload a room in 4 hours. So that's been the most efficient method we found. And I also like the stability of the soil, and all of the other things that we do have less touch points. So like when we take moisture readings, for example, like we use a moisture reader to determine how much water we should water in that the next watering, we can take a smaller sampling and still get a good look at where each cultivar is, as far as moisture levels.
So, one thing I would think would be more apparent would be any sort of nutrient deficiency or issue that you may have. I would expect to see it in the 10-gallon pot sooner than the 15 across the same cultivar. That's the biggest advantage I've seen to more soil, is just sort of that buffering effect in terms of deficiency or nutrient uptake. What are your experience of that, though?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And we do see the deficiencies that do pop up more quickly in the 10 gallons. We do sometimes actually see higher potency in the 10 gallons over the 15 gallons. And I feel like that's directly related because, of course, if you have an excess of nitrogen, from my experience, I've always seen that plants, if we feed a little too much nitrogen in, or if the soil had a little too much nitrogen to begin with, that we see a drop in potency. So I do believe that's like fairly well established inverse relationship. So we do see more deficiency earlier in the tens, but they do also have different drybacks, and that I think attributes sometimes to, or generally to um, uptake, of course. So if the plant stays a little bit too dry for too long, then that deficiency could essentially be a dry back issue versus a soil fertility issue.
Yeah, I would think maybe the in the 10 gallons, in addition to nitrogen, just the plant stress. You may
Hmm.
have, you know, unintentional plant stress through maybe osmotic pressure on the roots or something related to your watering or a lack of nutrients due to the smaller pot that may lead to higher, you know, translate to higher cannabinoid levels, like you were saying. Um, Typically at the expense of yields, I would say. Could be the case,
Correct.
but
Hmm.
yeah, no, I think that's an interesting comparison between 10 and 15, or let's just say a larger versus smaller container size with what we're calling living soils.
Correct. Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think that ultimately, as we expand and we move into 4 flower rooms or 6 flower rooms, we'll probably go to a 10-gallon only just to keep everything completely the same because obviously the more differences you have in your system, the more accommodations you have to make in your schedules and into the attention that you're giving the plants. So we would probably move to 10 gallons for the whole operation. But I think it's a pretty happy medium, a 10 gallon. Prior to a 10 gallon, I was using a 6.5 gallon, and I definitely saw more issues with deficiency than now I see in a 10. The 10 is more stable. We have 4x8 benches, and 10 tens on that 4x8 bench works pretty well with the canopy filling out without having any, which without having the plants obviously too crowded and enough room to work so that you can access all sides of the plants and have the right airflow.
So you're not going water only throughout the growth cycle in that 10 though either. Is that correct?
No, correct. Yeah, so we definitely start with a pretty heavily fortified soil. It's roughly 25% compost based. It's a soil that I've worked with a local soil maker to be used specifically for cannabis production. And it was a process that probably took us a full 2 years to fully develop. So we kind of started with their base soil and added some more fertility, a little more aeration, and got it to where we wanted with the dry back, and then just like focused a little bit more on individual nutrients, excuse me, and making sure that we had exactly what we wanted with the fertility levels. And that was based really on tissue testing, mid-cycle, late cycle, testing spent soil at the end and seeing what was left and what we started with. And then as I mentioned, we worked with that soil maker to really develop it how we wanted to. And then after that, I decided basically that one top dress per cycle with I use a granular chicken manure based fertilizer that's also made here in Ohio. That one top dress at week 2 was about the right amount of additional fertilizer that we had to add in a dry form. But then we also take that same fertilizer and weekly from week 2 through week 7, I take that same granular fertilizer. I mix it in a brute container, 44-gallon brute container, and put it on a bubbler overnight. So we do maybe 8 of those brutes per room. Bubble it overnight, which really essentially is just breaking it down and probably doing some level of nitrogen conversion. And then we give each plant a liter of that liquid once per week from week 2 through week 7. So that's essentially all the additional nutrient that we water into the soil. And I've tried I've done quite a few different little R&D trials with just loading all of that nutrient in on the front end into the soil, and definitely not had nearly the same results as when we sort of spoon feed it on a weekly basis in this partially decomposed way. Um, I do also push a lot of worm castings. So the worm castings are also made into a liquid, not a tea exactly, but just an extract. And so in veg, I like to really feed in a lot of worm casting extract. And then I do taper that off at the beginning of flower. But I also do a little bit of foliar feeding with a couple different products that I like for just kind of the beginning of the cycle. And so those foliar feeds, which are essentially just like a soy protein hydrolysate and a potassium product that I like quite a bit, I use those also, of course, certified organic products in veg through week 1 of flower. And then that's the only other nutrient that the plants get. And again, it's more front loading it in the vegetative cycle to like build that structure that we're looking for uh, in the flower finish.
Yeah, you brought up some good points in there. I think the first one I want to highlight is this idea that if you are in a container, and I look at a 10-gallon container as sort of a smaller size, relatively speaking, for growing in what we're calling living soil here, you will probably get much better results. You may be able to make it through a whole cycle water only, depending on lighting, CO2 levels, those sorts of other limiting factors, how you're watering. But if you can add fertility slowly throughout that cycle, I would absolutely expect to get better results. So I think that's a really good point to highlight. Did you want to touch on that before I bring
No,
back the
I
soil
would
mixing?
just say that, in the side by sides that we've done of putting that nutrient, the equal amount of nutrient in the front end, I mean, the yield was almost half of what it was when we add it in little bits throughout the cycle. So it's a pretty dramatic difference that I've seen from doing it that way.
Are you watering to runoff as well?
So we are essentially watering to runoff, but there's very little runoff.
Okay.
So I
Just trying
like
to
we
think
have a
through that.
saucer underneath each plant. So there's no like run to waste. So whatever does run off is recaptured and reused by the plant.
Interesting. Okay. And moving, going back to your um, formulation of a soil, you said it took about 2 years, and I think that's really interesting because that's the
Mhm.
number that I throw out to people when I say what it should take to formulate a soil. Uh, and it sounds like we had a similar process, a thought process. So you start with like a what I would call a base mix. So for us, that's something usually around peat moss, pumice, and a compost. And then we add fertility to that, and then we test and just turn one dial at a time. And once we get it kind of where we want it, then we start running plant trials and then further refine the process. And it just takes a long time. What
Yes. Mhm. Go
is
ahead.
there anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just say it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of testing, and R&D in general is really difficult in a production facility. I mean,
Yeah.
looking back, like if I could redesign the facility that we're in, I would definitely build out a small R&D room because I think if you have your own R&D room and you can trial things on like a 10 or 20 plant basis and take that testing, you could really move things forward a lot more quickly than you can when every square foot counts in your production facility. So in your production facility, your hands are kind of tied in the sense that you can only play around with so many things per cycle. And for me, that's generally maybe 10 plants, 10 to 20 plants a cycle. So I would much rather be able to do that outside of the production space and be able to just have side by sides running all the time. And even the other issue with R&D is just really, especially now when we have a team that's just so dialed in, is just, oh, you can only do this for this plant. You have to do this differently for this plant. It's just hard to stay as efficient, of course, with your task delegation when you have R&D going. Now, our team's been really creative in figuring out how to make little signs and markers and tags and things like that for plants that are supposed to get some sort of special instructions. And we have been able to collect much better data now that we have like this team that's really well established and knows what they're doing. Um, so it definitely can be done, but it's always challenging. The bigger part of it too is the testing, so like the extra expense of testing 10 plants specifically, and now what are we doing with that small batch? How is it going to be sold? What if the test results are different and we don't want to release it onto the market? So then that small batch has to essentially be frozen or used for a different purpose. So I mean, it has challenges all the way down the cycle, that make it just take more time and cost more money. So it is difficult, but we've definitely been able to do a fair share of it. And I think that as long as you're really being diligent about capturing the data, that's the most important part. Because it's easy to start the experiment, but it's harder to see it all the way through and then analyze the data. And sometimes it's really cultivar dependent, so that makes a big difference as well. So it gets tricky. But with the soil process, yeah, I would say that took us a solid 2 years, and it's ongoing. So, there's times when a supply input may change and they say, well, we have to shift to this. And so now we have to kind of start the process again. Or in certain situations, we realize that something is occurring that we want to improve again slightly upon, whether it's usually like porosity, drainage, dryback, things like that, more so than nutrient levels. And I feel pretty locked in on our nutrient levels at this point, just because we get such consistent high potency, and we also just get the yields that are achieving our goals all the time. Um, but there's always a question in the back of your mind, well, what if we tried a little bit more of this? Where would it go? So it's an
Mhm.
ongoing process, and I think that it should always continue, because the research and development is what you can't break the barrier until you've tried something new.
Yeah, and we talk about these inputs, fertilizers, compost, castings, all of these things, like they're consistent and they're homogeneous. And in the real world, frankly,
Exactly.
they aren't, and that does require testing.
For
So
sure.
I think that is important. And that's what you're paying for when you buy commercial soil, is that the company has done that testing for you. So to ask for testing results, I think, is a very reasonable request, and expectation. And then understanding how to interpret those results, because I've seen tests that have been put out publicly by various companies that highlight issues in my experience, yet they're being promoted as a good test. So I think understanding how to read a test is a really important skill.
For sure.
Just throw that
And
out there. And then
it's more so, it's also not just the batch testing that you're seeing, but even, and I found this with some of the other soil manufacturers that I worked with previously, is that the quality control of the product. So like you might get the batch testing every year, but your soil might come in a different state than it had other times. And I've had problems just like with vegetable production, because I always started all my plants in a greenhouse from seed every year, and I'm talking about like 10,000 plants, where some years the soil just wasn't of the same quality, whether it was too hot or it, had a different moisture, was able to hold moisture differently, that the quality control from batch to batch is really important. And I worry sometimes, because I'm working with a very small soil provider, that as these companies grow and get really big and start supplying soil to all over the country, can they maintain that same level of quality control? And I think that's really important.
yeah, the other thing I wanted to touch on was you were talking about figuring out whether the soil got you for drybacks, and essentially what you were highlighting is, what are the physical properties of the soil? Does it have the right levels of porosity and gas exchange and water retention that I want? And then from there, you started looking at fertility, which is sort of the chemical analysis, what we would get back from on a soil test report, looking at levels of calcium, magnesium, potassium, nitrogen, all of these things, and balancing those second. And I think that's really important, because there's sort of really, I look at it like a triangle, where we have when we talk about soils, we're looking at chemical, physical, and biological properties of soils, and those are really the that's how I like to approach, I guess, soil mixing or soil formulation.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a complex product. It's really not very simple and straightforward. And I think that when we started, the soils that I first was trialing were essentially just too heavy for the most part. And I needed to lighten them up more. And we worked to, like add some different, essentially like more perlite and different things that could open up the porosity of the soil a little bit more, because I really think that dry back that you're looking for is very important. And if you can't get and I know I've already said this, but if you can't get the watering and the dry back right, then you just really start to see a lot of nutrient problems. And I think oftentimes growers are focused more on the nutrient issues than they are just simply on the water holding capacity of the medium. It's just so important.
So when you say dryback, you're saying the soil was staying too wet for too long, so you weren't able to get any gas exchange around the in the root system. Is
Correct.
that
Yeah, exactly. So the
so?
structure of the soil being, really important, of course, because also how does it compact over time? How quickly does it compact and close out those pores, or how does it retain that porosity?
And when you say dryback, how dry are you letting the soil really get? What are we talking about bone dry, or are we talking about just a lower moisture level that allows you to re-water or re-wet the
Correct.
soil?
Yeah, just so I use like our cultivation technicians are using the Blue Lab Pulse moisture meter, which I like a lot. I think, it pairs with their phone pretty easily. They can go through and just like stick a lot of pots and get a general range. So as long as that's calibrated with the medium that you're using, I look for the plants being around 30% when I want to water again. So can the plants get to that 30% in the time that fits into our schedule to re-water? So like we only actually water our plants 2 times per week. So we water our plants on Mondays and we water our plants on Fridays. On Wednesdays is when we apply a tea. And like I said, that's usually either just a vermicompost extract or that's the bubbled granular fertilizer, which is like a nutrient tea. And so those on Wednesdays, they'll get a liter of tea, which is really pretty small amount of liquid. But on Mondays and Fridays, I like the plants to be able to take a full gallon on both days. So if the plants can take that full gallon, then I'm getting the dry back that I need. So I want them to reach that 30% or slightly less, but not over before they get that full gallon again. And then as the plants get through flower and they're really metabolizing really high in like week 4 through 8, let's say, then we do an additional moisture reading. So we do the moisture readings before each watering. So then we do an additional moisture reading on Wednesdays, and the plants that now are drying back too fast as they're really metabolizing hard and building a lot of flower, then they'll get a midweek watering. But that's usually very cultivar specific. So the majority of the plants are getting watered 1 gallon on Mondays, 1 gallon on Fridays. But then as we get into that like really heavy bulking phase, then plants will get a half gallon, sometimes even a gallon, depending on the cultivar, midweek. But that's usually only for about 3 weeks. And then we taper that off again.
Okay, okay. A couple thoughts. So first off, that Blue Lab pulse meter,
Hmm.
I did a full review of it on our
Okay.
YouTube channel for people
Uh-huh.
that are listening. It's got some really cool features in terms of how it connects with your phone and allows you to even snap photos or write notes about in relation to that reading that you're getting. So you get soil temperature and you get moisture, which is cool.
Correct. Yeah.
I wish it did
I
pH,
believe
but
I believe you also get EC, although we
yes, you
don't
do
we
get
don't really
EC.
use that component of it much.
Yes, that's right. You do get EC too.
Hmm.
And I think that that can be interesting. You do need to correlate it with the moisture level. There is a
For
relationship
sure.
there.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, but we have found in a couple places that we visited, when I bring that in and
Hmm.
we go to test the soil, we found either where we have issues, extremely high or extremely low EC, and that allows us to
Hmm.
figure it out really quickly as a
Nice.
consultant just
Yeah,
coming
that
into
makes
a room.
sense. Hmm.
But it sounds like you have a pretty dialed in program for what you guys are doing with consistency to where you wouldn't see huge swings in EC.
Right.
So you're able to use the pulse meter to measure your readings, and then when you water, you're able to water just twice a week. And I assume this is because the plants are still establishing roots, filling out the container. They're not necessarily needing as much water, and then you said you then add, because my first thought was like you only water on set days. Like how do you do that? Because in my experience, plants will need water, on it doesn't correlate necessarily with the work week as nicely as we would like it to. So
Right. Mhm.
you're able to do that by adding another supplementing watering as the roots fill out the pot, the plant starts growing more. We're further in flower, and now you're adding a third watering, it sounds like.
Correct. But the other thing is by using the moisture readers, we determine how much water the plants get on Mondays and Fridays, so it might not always be the same. So if a plant isn't drying back, if one cultivar isn't drying back as fast as another, that plant may only get a half gallon on Mondays and a gallon on Friday or something like that. So we're using the readings to help guide us into how much water each cultivar should get at that watering. So I like to get to that gallon point. I feel like when they're getting the gallon twice a week, that they're metabolizing the way that I want them to, but it really, when you have a plant that's 6 feet tall and a cultivar that only gets 2 feet tall and is real bushy or something like that, they're just not going to dry back at the same rate. So the moisture readings guide us as well with how much water they get per watering. And it's not perfect, of course, because we're not sampling every single plant, so in 744 plants in a room, we're not taking a reading off every plant, but we're taking enough of a sample size per cultivar to be able to say, hey, this strain seems like it's drying back slower. It's reading every morning at 50 or 60% on Mondays versus the rest reading at 30. We're going to cut that down to a half a gallon on Mondays, things like that. So it is adjusted more so than just by the day, but by the amount as well.
And how are you getting that half gallon? Is it a matter of counting when you're using a spray wand, or are you literally pouring out a half gallon into another container and then watering?
We're using just like a flow meter, gallon counter. I don't know exactly what you call it, but just that little gadget that you're just hooking onto the end of the hose in between the watering wand and the hose. So it's just measuring the flow that's going past that device. Yeah, it's pretty nice. It works pretty well. I mean, they're an inexpensive little piece of equipment, and we kind of cycle through quite a few of them because you'll use them for a couple months or maybe 6 or 8 months, and they won't. A technician will say, I don't think this one's reading quite the same because they're used to the rhythm of how long a gallon takes to deliver to the plants, and it seems like it's off, then we replace them. I mean, but I'd say they're pretty effective overall. So yeah, all the technicians just use a hose, watering wand with the gallon counter on it, and we determine how many gallons or half a gallon, three-quarters of a gallon, whatever we want to give them, and then they're just watching the meter and going to the next plant.
And talking since we're talking about water, what is your water source?
So the facility was built out with RO water. Um, as we're expanding into another facility, I think we're going to move just to city water that's filtered versus using reverse osmosis in the new facility. I think it's a bit of overkill, and it also is pretty wasteful, and it doesn't really align with the company's mission. Um, but it works fine. I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion over whether reverse osmosis water can negatively impact good soil and soil microbial life. And I think that it's hard to say. It's something that I've thought quite a lot about over the past few years or 5 or 6 years. Is would it be better to not be using reverse osmosis water? Um, but since our plants don't run off at all, I feel like the fact that if it is like over solubilizing nutrients, and it's like corrosiveness essentially, and washing some nutrients out of the soil, they're able to kind of go back in because they're in a saucer and so it's all contained. If we were running to waste, if we were running, like a lot of water out the bottom of the pots, I think it would probably flush nutrients too quickly. But that's not the case. We're with our system, so it works pretty well. And then considering that we do use it with our teas, at least we kind of know where it's at and we know what we're adding, and we know that we're not getting any like antagonism from maybe the calcium and magnesium that's in the tap water.
And what are you running for PPFD at Canopy?
So I run up to around 500. I'm sorry, I start off at around 400 to 500 in veg, finish around 700 ppfd in veg, and then run from 700 and top out around a max of 1100 in flower. So I'm usually hitting right around 1050, and I find like that's kind of the sweet spot for me. So like the lights that we're using at 144 fluent spiders in each room, which um, they're reaching the end of their life here, so I am experimenting with some other fixtures to see if there's, an advantage to trying something new. But right around 1050 seems to be where I don't start to see light burn or, plant stress. Once I get above that, which I have experimented higher than that, I just haven't really seen a benefit. Like I know a lot of people run substantially higher than that and say
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to get higher yield, but I usually just see too much plant stress above that, that it just doesn't equate to higher yield. Now I know you have to obviously feed in higher and the plants have to metabolize higher, so you need more CO2 and higher temperature, all those things,
Sure.
which is sort of hard to push in soil from my experience. It's not like hydroponics, obviously, where you're just dialing in a certain feed level. So for me, I think we're pushing the plants kind of as hard as we can, nutrient wise. And that seems to be the right point to get us the yields and the quality, which are always a balance, of course. I know a lot of people push really high yields, but those people, when I see their systems, I feel like oftentimes it's at the expense of quality. And so that's always, you're always trying to find this sweet spot of quality and yield. And that usually hits it for me around there.
And what are the CO2 levels that you're running in the rooms?
So in veg, I run around 800 ppms, and then in flower, I go from that 800 ppms up to about 1400 ppms, and it's
Oh,
just adjusting up by the week. I've tried some rooms of dropping the CO2 levels down in the last 2 weeks. I still think it's sort of questionable whether or not it's just a waste of CO2 toward the end. If
yeah.
the plants are really using it, when you start to drop temperature and you start to hold back on water and the plant metabolism starts slowing down, is it really necessary to run that high to the exact finish? And I think there's been a lot of discussion about that and maybe disagreement about that. So I do usually step down CO2 in the last 2 weeks, but not back down to like 600 like some people do. So I'll usually finish around 1,000 ppms CO2 in a room.
Oh, that's pretty high.
And
1400's high. I
mhm,
mean, in my experience, um, and I would speculate. I mean, I don't think there's a ton of research on this that at least that I've seen, that stepping it down in the final weeks would be beneficial
yeah,
because you're just not utilizing it with the amount of light and metabolism that's happening in the plant towards the
exactly.
very end of its life cycle.
Hmm.
Assuming you have a plant that wants to finish around the time that you're harvesting, because I know in commercial facilities you don't have the luxury of running a plant an extra 2-3 weeks to hit
For
its
sure.
maybe optimal cannabinoid or terpene levels, just because you're on a schedule.
Definitely. I would say that, CO2 is kind of an elusive one because it's really hard, and just like with any R&D, it's hard to isolate one control, especially in a big room. Like when we're in a room that's half of our total production area, if I was to drop it to, 600 ppms in the last 2 weeks and I saw 10% reduction in yield, that would be a big problem. So it's
Yeah,
really difficult again to experiment in these large flower rooms. But it's also there's just so many variables, of course, every cycle. So I haven't really experimented a whole lot with CO2. What I have changed more over my years of in this same system of production is humidity. I would say that's probably the biggest thing that's changed from where I started and as to where I am right now. Temperature, I've always ran a similar temperature in the room. So like in the peak metabolism phase of flower, I'm running like around 80 degrees. And I do definitely drop that down pretty substantially in the last 2 weeks to get like the color and the finish and the terpene profile that we're looking for. And I think that cooling it down and just sort of preserving the terpenes at the end and not cooking things off is pretty important. Um, and I have played around more with the differential between day and night temperature. In the beginning, I was only running at a 5-degree differential, and I've pushed that much farther apart now. And I have seen, again, it's hard to attribute it to just one specific thing because you're making a lot of changes each cycle sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and especially in cultivar. Like we run 8 to 12 cultivars a cycle and they're always different. So
Yeah,
it's hard
yeah.
to really truly say, but I feel as though bringing that differential farther apart and trying even to achieve definitely a 10-degree spread, but even up to a 15-degree spread in the last 2 weeks can really push yield and quality. I feel as though I've seen that quite a bit, and I've definitely read some studies, and I try and dig into research all the time because it's
Mm-hmm.
so exciting, obviously, now all the new research that's coming out. And I've seen some research that suggested that a 70-degree night temperature and an 81-degree day temperature was optimal for yield on certain cannabis strains. And I feel pretty similar to that spread being probably the most effective of the different ones that I've tried. But as far as humidity, that's something that I've really raised over my time in production here. And I think it was primarily fear driven at first, to be honest, is like running a room at 72% humidity and flower just went against everything that I knew about managing disease in cannabis. And so I was very nervous to ever run those higher humidities. And now I run that 72 to 74% humidity definitely through the veg cycle into week 1 and 2. And then when I step it down much more gradually, and I'm really running in the 68 to 70% humidity range through week 3 to 4, and only really stepping it down into like the 50s and potentially below in the very last few weeks of flower. And I have
Mm-hmm.
not seen any more problems with plant disease at those higher humidities. Honestly, I feel like running that 70% humidity through the first half of flower has actually been beneficial in preventing powdery mildew.
Yeah.
Um, I really I feel like I've definitely clearly seen, I've dealt with powdery mildew. We've had a few instances. Primarily it comes from, genetics, bringing in new strains and things like that. But when I have had issues, it's usually been when there was a problem with the management of the HVAC system so that there was bigger swings in the
Yes.
humidity. And now that I've been able to tighten that band up, which I really attribute to Blaze Dykeman, who is an HVAC specialist that I brought in 2.5 years ago. He's really changed some things about how we run the air conditioners and the dehumidifiers, and we really run the dehumidifiers very little now. So he's using like the reheat component of the air conditioning to heat the air on the supply side so that we're doing most of the dehumidification with the air handlers versus the dehumidifiers. And the difference in that band and tightening up that band has just been so beneficial to the plant disease cycles. I'm able to maintain like a 5% humidity band, whereas when we were using the dehumidifiers, there's 18 dehumidifiers in each room. The band would swing sometimes 20% from peak humidity to low humidity over and
Yeah.
over again every hour, and I feel like that was a big driver of disease spread.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right on, spot on with that. And getting back to this idea you mentioned, you're bringing in new cultivars all the time. Every room is, you're changing so many dials. It's really hard to know exactly what's making a difference. I think that's a really important thing to highlight because we are, if we want to do a controlled experiment, it really does need to be across a few different cultivars so we can get an idea of the genetic diversity that's in cannabis and how it responds to a given, mechanism or change. And that's where this, getting back to this R&D room, that you mentioned you wish
Yeah,
you had.
right.
Again, like every time we consult with someone, that's the first thing I look for on their design is to make sure they have that because it's not only an R&D room, but it's also a quarantine space. So when you
Definitely.
bring in
Hmm.
new genetics, you need to be testing those genetics to make sure that they're clean, and you need to grow them out to make sure that they don't have pests because some things will pupate in the leaves or
Absolutely.
in the soil, and we need to give them time to really make sure that they're clean. So I wanted
Definitely.
to highlight that. A
Yeah.
question you brought up a ton of really great stuff there. A question I had though, going back, was all the way to CO2. I was wondering, how do you disperse that evenly across the room, being that CO2 is heavier than air? What's your method for making sure that this, massive vertical difference that you have across canopies stays as relatively even as you can?
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult. The way so the CO2 injects into one of the duct socks on one of the air handlers.
Hmm.
So essentially the air handler is then just moving it through the room. That's not going to be perfect because they're not always running when the CO2 would inject. So it definitely isn't perfectly homogenized. But we have a lot of horizontal fans in the room that are moving in kind of a serpentine design. So we have a serpentine design on each um, tier where one row is blowing one way and then the next row is blowing the opposite way for each of the four rows, and that is replicated on the second and third tier. And I think just having that high volume of vertical air movement, plus there's some vertical fans in the rooms as well, and just keeping that air stirred really well is just our best strategy for homogenizing all of the air. Inevitably, the air flow and the climate are not the same. I have sensors on the third tier, I have sensors on the first tier. So we have the Argus control system, which gives us a lot of data, of course, over the environmental set points in the room, and that's extremely helpful. But also I've installed just some smaller, like cheap sensors to be able to see what's happening on the third tier compared to the ground floors. And the third tier definitely has more swings because the air handlers are all up there, so it's substantially cooler when the air conditioning is running. It can heat up quite a bit as the heat in the room rises. So I see bigger swings up there. And what I've done over the years is generally I just plant the shorter cultivars on the third tier, the ones that have kind of a more compact canopy. My theory with that is just that these shorter, stockier plants that have this more compact canopy are able to hold kind of a boundary of humidity within their own canopy. So that like sort of boundary layer that those shorter plants create themselves is a bit more of a buffer. And then, I mean, it's just a workflow management thing too. I mean, if you have a plant that has a ton of stretch and you're trellis training it and doing all this work to harvest it and de-trellis it, um, it's much easier for that to be on the ground floor because you can just pay more attention to it without having to get up on a scissor lift. So those more compact plants just work better from a labor perspective as well on the third tier. Another thing that I've started doing maybe 2 years ago was using air movers on the floor. So just like a basic big air mover fan that you plug in that can really blow a lot of air down the floor. We put those at the ends of the aisles on each side of the room because what we noticed specifically was the back corners of the room on the ground tier had a lot of problems with pests or disease, and it was just an airflow issue. It was just like creating kind of a pocket back there where there wasn't much air movement, and heat would kind of build up in those back corners, and we would see things like thrips kind of setting in those back corners of the rooms because there just wasn't any good airflow. And so now we put an air mover in those back corners, and we're always like blowing air out of that back corner of the room, and that helps to just kind of keep that air stirring on the floor as well. And that probably helps with your CO2 because your CO2 is going to come settle. And as long as you have this air movement, not just above the canopy, but on the floor, you're moving air off of the floor and kind of redistributing it back into the mix.
Yeah, that was another question I was going to ask you was, do you typically see most of your pathogen and pest issues and plant stress stuff on the top canopy because it does have more fluctuation? Or
I
have you
would
not noticed that
say
as a pattern?
I would say at first, so like the first year that we were in production, we only ran on two tiers. And then the second year we moved into the third tier, and it definitely took some time to figure out how best to manage the climate there. And it also, I mean, there's just it's multiple things because it's not just the climate, but it's just the individual workers often can spend less time on the third tier. There's less eyes up there. You may not be catching something as quickly. And we have quite a good scouting program so that we're making sure that we're looking at all the plants every day and that sort of thing, um, from a kind of a bird's eye view as well. But it's still difficult to get the same amount of attention to the higher tiers. Like everything is just more difficult. Like I say, things take twice as long on the second tier, but they take four times as long on the third tier. And that's just as simple as harvesting the plants. On the ground floor, you're just cutting them down, you're carrying them over, you're weighing them. On the second tier, you're handing them down. And then on the third tier, you're binning them and running them, like we actually run them down like a pulley sort of thing to drop them down in a bin to the people on the ground, and you're running that pulley back up. So everything on the third tier takes longer, and it's just more challenging. But then the benefit of the third tier is it also doesn't have a top. So the first and the second tier have essentially a roof, which is the bench of the tier above them, but the third tier is just open. And I did play around a little bit with that because I was concerned about the air conditioners being up there, which occasionally, you have something that's leaking or a pipe that's clogged, or just a machine that freezes. Like the dehumes used to freeze a lot when we used the dehumidifiers, and then they're leaking water on the plant. So we did experiment with like putting like a plexiglass ceiling on the third floor. But then as we were able to better manage the equipment and dial that in more on a control system side, and I think the big benefit of getting a person working in the building on a daily basis that's like an HVAC specialist and is really able to like do the preventative maintenance in a more complete way. Um, as we had less and less problems with the machines, then I decided just to remove that third tier roof essentially, because there is so much air that gets stirred up there just from the air handlers running all the time. So I've found actually that due to the increased airflow up there, even though there's a bigger swing in humidity and temperature, you have substantially more air moving on the top, and that it probably offsets a lot of the disease pressure that you would get from those swings just with that amount of air. Like when you're up there, I mean, it's just like blasting you when the air conditioners are on, and you can see the plants even on the camera just really waving really hard on the third tier when all that airflow is up there. So
Yeah,
I
and
think it kind
then
of balances.
moving the plants up and down. You talked about dust management. Are you seeing more issues with microbials and stuff or things, from the soil ending up on the buds as you go to the lower levels from that top level?
Not so much. I mean, we during the transplanting, there's definitely an amount of soil that gets stirred up, and we see that just on like the filters on the HVAC equipment. Usually we wait until we do the transplant, then we change all the filters because just from that one day of transplanting, there's so much dust that's created that the filters just get dirty from one day like that. But then once the plants are in place and they're starting to get watered in, we don't really see much more problems as far as dust management. We do, after the plants are in place for a week or two, do a full cleaning of the benches with the plants in place so we can eliminate all that dust. And that can include wiping down the lights and the crossbars and everything. And I like to do that early in flower so that you're not moving microbes around once the flower is developed. But once that initial cleaning is done, which, we like to just have that occur by the third week of flower, then we haven't really seen too many problems with dust or microbes coming from the soil. I don't use any sort of mulch. I'm not a big fan of mulch because I like indoors because I mean, I love it outdoors, but indoors, I think it can host problems, like fungus gnats and different things. And I like to be able to see that dry back and have that top layer of the soil dry out enough so again that we can control things like fungus gnats. Plus we also do the top dress and we do applications of like Stratiolalia scomitis, that predator mite in the soil to combat things like thrips and fungus gnats. So I like to have the top layer of the soil unmulched, but it does become challenging like when you harvest the plants, especially if they're really long, tall cultivars, trying to cut down the plants and making sure none of the flower drags into the soil. But what we do, and I mean, and again, I think we have the luxury of being able to pay a lot of attention to these plants individually because we are a smaller grow, is anytime a bud touches the soil, that goes into a fresh frozen batch and doesn't get sold as flower. So we just eliminate the risk by, if we know bud is touching soil, it just doesn't get tested for a panel
You're,
layer.
you're doing some foliar applications too that I assume would sort of rinse the plants a little bit too of any dust that might have got on them at transplant.
Yeah, so foliar applications are interesting because outdoor farming for vegetables, I did a lot of foliar feeds, foliar microbial products for disease prevention. And of course, you're dealing with rain, washing those products off. And I think a lot of the product mix rates are designed sort of for outdoor agriculture. So they may I don't know, how people are making the mix rates that work for these companies, pesticide companies, but my suspicion is that's taken into account how long that product will actually stay on the leaves until it'll need to be reapplied, and that rain, dew, things like that are a factor in how long it persists on the plant. Indoors, of course, when you spray something on a plant, it's going to stay there. You're not going to wash it off. There's no rain, there's no dew. So you do have to be careful with what you're spraying on the plants, particularly in flower, because that might persist a lot longer. And I did learn a little bit the hard way with one particular product when I tank mixed it with another one, and it kind of created a population explosion. So I like the product Cease a lot from Bioworks. Bacillus subtilis, I think, is a great tool for disease prevention, whether it's cease or serenade, or there's a host of products, obviously, that use Bacillus subtilis as the active ingredient. And I've used quite a bit of that in indoor agriculture as a powdery mildew preventative. And we are tested for total aerobic count in Ohio, which a lot of states are not, like Michigan, for example, is not. And so I primarily use it in veg, but did use it in the beginning of flower. In Ohio, there's a spray ban after day 21 of flower, so you can't compliantly use most products after day 21. There's a couple products that are on the list that you can use after day 21, which I think are regalia, which I don't know how you would use that once the bud is formed, because it would stay in the bud. And you can use things like, I think, xylitol, and there might be one other kind of cannabis specific product. Maybe it's like a citric acid product or something like that, that you can use toward the after day 21. But we've always just done all of our sprays prior to day 21, which is how the compliance was initially established. Then there was some lobbying from certain growers to use a couple things after the spray ban. So we never spray after day 21 as a practice. So when I was applying these microbial products prior to day 21, I never had an issue with the flower then failing for total aerobic until a few cycles ago, when we suddenly started to see a much higher aerobic bacteria count ticking up on a lot of our dry flower samples. And what I had been using, and I actually found it was very, very effective, is I was tank mixing Ferticell Explorer with Cease. And by tank mixing those, my thought was, first of all, every time you do a foliar spray, it takes a substantial amount of labor and there's an REI. And so you can only pack so many of those into a cycle if you need your employees working in that room. And I, in the beginning, did no foliar applications on the plants because of just my fear of failing for something that you're spraying on the plants, of course. So the first few years, I did no foliar applications at all. Then I started using a little bit of the Ferticell Explorer, which is soy protein hydrolysate, as like a boost to increase our yields a bit and give it a quick bioavailable nitrogen as a foliar application. But I was also using cease as a, biofungicide essentially. And then I thought, well, why don't I just tank mix them? And this way we can save one spray and have less REI. And in doing so, I found that this is just theory essentially, but I think I feel pretty confident that this is what's been going on, is it was making the bacteria in the cease live much longer, kind of go through like a population explosion. And so I think what was potentially happening was by feeding the bacteria like this nitrogen, and also the nitrogen potentially being somewhat sticky, it was making like a sticker effect. And we were seeing the aerobic counts go way, way up once we tank mixed those two products together. It also was very effective at controlling powdery mildew. So we had previously had some powdery mildew in the rooms. We were worried it was going to persist into the next cycle. And then we started tank mixing those products. It was gone. And I mean, it was like gone through the whole facility and it never came back. But the risk is that when you're using a live product that's like a Bacillus subtilis, you could fail your total aerobic count for something that is essentially a beneficial microbe. And so you have to be very careful with foliars because changing the mix rate or changing if you're tank mixing things, of course it can have unintended consequences and they can be beneficial to the health of the plant, but then can lead to a potential fail if you're not really staying on top of your test results and watching trends. And so once we started seeing that trend, we're like, okay, this might be too much of a good thing. And now we need to go back to eliminating that or not applying them together. So foliars are always tricky. And I'm just of the philosophy of with indoor production, you want to be very careful about how many you apply and at what rates because they can persist on the flower and there's no rain to wash them off unless you're coming back and doing a water spray and removing them. But then that creates more of a risk of plant disease because you're wetting the plants again. So just like in vegetable production outside, you want to be careful about how much you wet the leaves. And so I'm not a big fan of wetting leaves indoors unless, of course, you have a really good airflow and the plants are going to dry very quickly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting anecdote and experience, and I appreciate you sharing that. I want to change topics just for the sake of time because we've already been talking for a while.
Sure.
And I wanted to get one more question in because I know people would love to hear the answer to this. So, what is your thought process around this? So, I know you don't reuse the soil because we talked about this. Can you explain your reasoning behind this and why that's your policy at Galenas?
So, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of pushback from ownership to reuse the soil, which I completely understand because the cost of buying new soil is substantial.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One reason though, well, let's start here. I am definitely a proponent of reusing soil. I like to reuse my own soil at home all the time for my garden plants, my potted plants, flowers, all these sort of things. And I think that if you have the right system in place to properly re-amend your soil and store it properly so that you can reuse it, probably makes the most sense if you have the equipment and the infrastructure to be able to do that. And the footprint that we're on, we don't even have enough space to park our cars, let alone re-amend soil and store it outdoors. And so, we're right in downtown Akron and we're a very tight spot there that we just don't have the infrastructure. So realistically, if we were to reuse soil, it would have to get hauled somewhere else, re-amended, and then sent back to us, which I don't know if that would offset the cost very much. But as far as reusing a soil in the same pot, I mean, just not possible in a 10 gallon. I mean, by the end of the cycle, these plants are all roots. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of soil left.
Mm-hmm.
But what I have done to kind of find the best of both worlds there is first, before Galenas established their Michigan facility, which has now been up and running for 3 years, I was donating all of that soil to a community garden group called Let's Grow Akron, and they were gladly bringing a truck every month to fill up with all the spent soil and take that out to their community gardens and use it to build their beds. Um, so that went on for about a year and a half. Then once the Galenas Michigan grow was in effect, I talked with our compliance agents, made sure that it was okay that we could ship root the, chop the plants down and ship the root ball and the soil to our Michigan grow. And that has been great in the sense that we put it directly into the field, and we've taken a field of 7 acres that was almost pure clay and really dramatically improved it by adding these hundreds of yards of soil quarterly to the outdoor beds. So it does get reused. It only gets reused in the other facility outdoors. Um, the other reason that I'm just hesitant to reuse soil indoors is because I really, with such a short cycle, I really need things to be, I don't want to say perfect because not every batch of soil is exactly the same, but I need it to be as optimized as possible coming in so that there's just no downtime, so that the plants have everything they need as far as soil structure, nutrient level, all that as close to perfect as it can be each cycle. So there's not a 7-day period of time where I'm figuring out why the plant isn't performing how I expected it to. It's such a compressed cycle that it's just really important for things to start as perfect as possible, in my opinion. And so I'm glad that have this outlet that we can send the soil and it can be used outdoors. Um, I think that working with a community garden group or working with another farm to take that soil and repurpose it is a total excellent waste stream management process because it still has a lot of value. It just doesn't have the value that I need it for to grow a crop in this, system that I need to produce a certain yield each and every time and a certain quality each and every time.
Great. Yeah. So it sounds like it's a risk management as well as a space limitation issue for you. And
Definitely.
that, I think that's, I think that's great that you're able to kind of explain the thought process behind it because I knew people would ask. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention too, one, I kind of call it my secret weapon, but I do a lot with vermicomposting at the grow. And again,
Mm-hmm.
that was something that was a little bit difficult to bring into production in the facility. So I've now set it up outside of the facility because of just the bugs and stuff, that you get obviously when you have like some really vibrant worm bins. But now that we've established these outdoor worm bins, bringing in the vermicompost, using that in like an extract on a weekly basis or even bi-weekly basis in the veg cycle has made like a dramatic improvement in our plant health. And I found a review, which maybe you could put up on your page, that I've been even like carrying it around with me for the past 6 or 8 months because I keep kind of looking back and forth at it when I'm at work and thinking about why is this working so good? Why do these worm castings that I make here, why are they so effective? And it's something that I was taught as when I first started farming for Great Lakes Brewing Company by another person who was a big proponent of worm farming, but I've always used it in my vegetable production models in my home grow and everything. And I found that it's really not that difficult to create your own worm castings and use them in an indoor commercial application. Um, it doesn't take a lot, so they're really packed with nutrients and enzymes and microbes, and you can multiply that out in an extract and hit 1,000 plants with them and really get a lot of bang for your buck with your own worm castings. I've tried packaged worm castings, prepackaged worm castings. I just don't find them to be as live or as effective as what I find when I make my own worm castings. And I think that it's just a really undeveloped tool still for commercial growers to really revamp their microbial activities of their soils and also just basically provide more bioavailable nutrients and have like the humic substances and all the different things that come from worm castings packaged right in there so that
Mm-hmm.
you're breaking down the nutrients that are in the soil more quickly and providing them in like a plant available format much more quickly. And I just see incredible difference, even especially in the veg cycle where we'll apply a worm casting extract on Friday, and it's like the plants have like doubled in size on Monday. It's just really unbelievable all the benefits that vermicompost has with cannabis. I think they're meant to be for sure.
Yeah, I'll share the link
Mhm.
to the paper on the
Awesome.
podcast page for people that are interested. And just really quickly, what is your bedding that you're using, and what are you feeding your worms? Just
So the
people are going to
worms
ask.
are just getting all food scraps, and I have my employees, all that are interested in bringing in their food scraps, take home a 3-gallon bucket once a week, and they bring it back on Tuesdays full of compost, and we feed that directly to the worms. I do also use a lot of the, like when you buy an Amazon package and you get that brown paper, that's the packing material. As a bigger operation, we get a lot of Amazon packages, and so we get a lot of that brown packing paper, and so I like using that. And then I just tell my employees that bring back their food scraps, it's everything pre-plate, nothing post-plate, so we don't have like salad dressings and things like that involved. So it's just your pre-plate vegetable trimmings, eggshells, coffee grounds, coffee filters, any sort of fruits and vegetables without a super concentration of, sometimes, like, I think it's good to just have a good mix, like not all onions or not all lemons or things like that. So you just
Mhm.
don't swing your pH too much in your worm bin. But overall, it's just food scraps and brown carbon type papers, newspapers, um, brown packing paper, and no soil, just straight food scraps. I have 4 large bins now. I like to make my bins so that the worms can go into the ground when it gets really cold outside. So I use hardware cloth underneath the bins and cut big round holes in the bottom of the bins. That way they can just migrate into the soil if it gets too cold. You're not killing your worms in like a real deep freeze. And I found, just from my own personal experience, I've had one of these bins in my backyard that most of the time they stay through the whole winter as long as you keep feeding them. But if not, they repopulate again in the spring. And I just manage them so that, I always have old castings toward the back of the bin and feeding in the fresh food at the front of the bin, so that when we do pull the castings, there's not a ton of worms left in them. But if there are, we do put them in the pots, because they will make their way back out into the world, and they do live through the whole cycle. But we try not to put too many of them in the pots. So it's primarily just worm castings put into like a large compost tea bag, soaked in 40 gallons of water, and kind of massaging the bag so that you're getting all the extract into the water, and then watering that into the plants once or twice a week through veg into like week 1 of flower, if there's the time for it. But especially in the veg cycle, I feel like it's just like a total inoculant that then
Mhm.
you're creating like a biodiversity there that starts the whole cycle of beneficial growth for the plant. And I mean, in that review, there's even one study that was done on cannabis and vermicompost that showed that even if you soaked seed in vermicompost extract, that they saw greater yield down the
Hmm.
road with the cannabis just from simply soaking the seed. So I think on the inoculation side, there's really a lot that we still haven't learned about how beneficial this can actually be for cannabis.
Yeah, a few thoughts on this. So, and again, the article will be available on the podcast page. Vermicompost is incredible. The way that worms are able to take and translocate nutrients into more plant available forms, increase biological diversity and nutrient cycling in soils. They have a ton of incredible benefits. Uh, the things that I think of also though with this is when we talk about consistency and we talk about compost or vermicompost. I just want to remind listeners that um, that's not we're not all applying the same thing. So the vermicompost used in these studies is probably different than your vermicompost. So I
True.
think trialing this is really important and seeing what results you're getting. Obviously, your mix is working really well in your facility, and I think in general, it's much harder to screw up vermicompost than it is compost. But yeah, that's just something I want to throw out there because with compost tea, for example, people take research on that and try and extrapolate results, and every tea is different, just
For sure.
even more so than when making an extract. So I just
Definitely.
want to mention that.
I
And
think
then,
the freshness is really important too. Sorry, but I think
oh no
the
no yeah, well I think there's something to that. I think you
mhm.
could maybe achieve if you were to use packaged or commercial vermicompost to, get it to the right moisture level again, maybe add some food sources to it to reinvigorate the microbes, you could
True.
maybe
Hmm.
get back to the same level of what you're achieving, or at least closer to it based on what you're sharing there.
For sure.
Um,
Hmm.
the only other thing I want to mention, and I've been hearing more and more about, is this idea of PFAs or PFAS being in cardboard. And so I've moved away using it for sheet mulching, and I do
Hmm.
wonder if some of it could. And again, I don't know how this is broken down by worms or by things, but I've moved away from using it as bedding too in in worm bins for that reason. But again,
Right.
this is a really new thing. We're still learning about it. We don't even have available testing for it in most cases, and it's certainly not being tested for in the cannabis industry. But I don't know. It seems like with microplastics and PFAS and everything,
Definitely.
we're all
I
screwed.
get it's funny, I know, and it's with so many things, because
Yeah,
everything has some amount of heavy metals and everything has some amount of
totally.
plastics and things like that you really there's nothing that's pure and nothing that's truly clean. But I think that as this review is pointing out, there's an incredible amount of remediation that these microbes that are either in the worm's gut or that kind of coexist in a symbiotic relationship with worms have an effect of being able to biodegrade even things like these types of chemicals that we're finding from plastics. I believe in that study it did even point something out about PFAS, and I think there's a lot of real value to the sort of remediation factor that vermicompost provides that could, even potentially remediate things that are in the soil prior to adding the vermicompost, such as heavy metals. And so I think that it's quite an interesting compound that vermicompost creates. And like I said, using it fresh, I think makes a big difference because all of these enzymes and different all this microbial activity is still so vibrant and diverse. And I think that it's really kind of a new frontier of agriculture. And it's interesting because in indoor agriculture, it's somewhat more applicable. In the field, of course, and I did a lot of sheet composting in my field with spent grains from the brewery process, which is a great worm food, by the way, spent grain. And they love
Mm-hmm.
that and would come up and feed on it. And you could really build your worm populations with spent grain. But I did a lot of sheet composting using cardboard and things like that for mulches. And you can obviously encourage large worm populations, and maybe there's some degree of toxic compounds in some of these things that we're using that could negatively contribute to your soil health. But in indoor applications, it's difficult to find something that you can make in sort of a small amount that doesn't take a lot of work, but you can spread it out and get the benefit to all the plants in the form of an inoculant. And I just really feel like vermicomposting is one of those sort of special things that you can actually, instead of just buying, your inputs, you can create your own live input in a very simplified manner that doesn't take very much work. And it's actually
Yep.
quite engaging to the employees to be able to bring in their compost and see it broken down by worms and go back to contributing to the plant health. It's actually really stimulated some people to start composting at home who were not composting previously. And so it's something that's small, but that you can multiply out on a fairly large scale and provide like a really substantial amount of benefit to your plants through a very simple and small sort of system that doesn't take very much work. So for me, it was one way of bringing sort of that outdoor regenerative agricultural world indoors in a system that so far, at least, I haven't seen any negatives in the sense of higher heavy metal loads on my flower or, a microbe that might be problematic. So I think there's like some degree of balance that these microbes create that are working, like in harmony to balance the negative pathogens. And there's a lot of detail in that review too about the pathogen suppressing benefits of vermicompost to even be able to, like negate things like fusarium and plant diseases that are very serious for cannabis that could be potentially offset or prevented by using vermicompost. So a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of interesting uses for cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. vermicompost is amazing. There's a lot of
Mm,
different ways we can use it in our gardens, and I highly recommend that people
definitely.
set up their own worm bin. Yeah,
Hmm.
no, that's great advice.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate
Absolutely,
it. I know there's a lot more we could talk about. We may have
for
to
sure.
schedule another chat sometime in the near future.
Well, it was really fun. I appreciate you having me, Tad. Honestly, when I launched into the cannabis industry like almost 6 years ago, your podcast gave me a ton of knowledge and confidence to be able to do the things that I do now. So I think the collaboration that you provide to the industry it just can't be valued enough. There's still, unfortunately, a lot of people that are very tight-lipped about what they do and what techniques are working for them or not working for them. And it holds back the industry as a whole. In vegetable production, there was much more collaboration, much more sharing of information. And when I stepped into cannabis, I felt like closed off to other farmers. And your podcast really, it's very exciting for me to be here because it's kind of come full circle that it was so beneficial for me to hear these voices. And I've networked with a lot of people that you've had on the podcast now and created long lasting relationships with people specifically from hearing them here. So I appreciate what you
Oh,
do.
that's great. I love
It's
that.
great.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much, and I hope we can stay in touch because I think you're totally right. The more we can collaborate in this industry, the more transparency we have, the better off we all are, and especially in promoting this side of the industry, this concept of regenerative agriculture and more sustainable cultivation and organics and things like that. So yeah.
Absolutely. I see it in the craft brewery industry all the time. And my husband being a brewer, he's even said to me, like, all these brewers come from other breweries all the time. We open the doors and we greet them with open arms and we share knowledge and share products, and it's part of what makes craft brewing so special. And I think it's finally kind of coming full circle in Ohio, where there is a lot more collaboration now and industry wide. I hope to see it just get better and better with the education and the knowledge and the sharing. So I think we're on the right track.
All right.